Hi, I'm Will Johnson, also known as Power Nerd Insights. I work as a senior Power Platform specialist for Vantage 365, and I'd like to welcome you to this Power Nerd presentation. Welcome to this week's session. Today we're going to be looking at Dataverse versus SharePoint. We're going to be looking at what's the difference. We have a bit of a packed agenda today. So, first things first, introduction, that's where we are now, but we're going to be covering quite a lot in terms of what the difference is between Dataverse and SharePoint. So we're going to be covering licensing, capacity constraints, permissions models, security features, data modeling, file storage, any other major differences. We're going to provide a bit of a summary at the end. And as we did last week, which we found really useful, we're going to have a discussion section at the end where anybody can speak. And we can have that kind of discussion piece to, see what experiences you've all had and obviously share that knowledge and help each other out. But first thing before we launch straight into the licensing, rules of engagement. I always do these and I try to keep it as clear as possible. So um, during the course of the session, if you have a question, please do post it in the chat. I'll try to get to them in terms of when they're relevant, uh, but we will kind of see when we go. Rules of engagement, yes. So, like I said, any questions, pop them in the chat. There is no such thing as a stupid question. I have a 4-year-old daughter. She tests that assumption pretty regularly, and we haven't found one yet. So feel free to ask. We're all here to help each other out, and we're all looking for kind of the answers and the knowledge. Um, that being said, obviously we do have the discussion slash Q&A section at the end. If you do want to speak up rather than popping your question in the chat, that's your opportunity to do so. I might cover your question later in. So we'll get straight into it. We've gone through our rules of engagement. Very first thing, Dataverse versus SharePoint. We hear a lot of this, a lot of talk about Dataverse versus SharePoint in terms of what should we use, what do we first learn, and a lot of questions like that. Well, actually, I'm hoping this session will kind of maybe clear that up a bit. So, starting with the question that we always get, licensing. So when we look at licensing, it's what licensing is available, what licensing gives us access, and kind of how do we deal with that. So let's start with the simple one, SharePoint. So access to SharePoint is generally gained through a Microsoft 365 plan and the licensing that comes in. For example, E5 and E3 licenses, they will immediately give access to SharePoint Online. Okay, so that's very simple. It's one that we all tend to use day to day in terms of our work and business. We'll have access to SharePoint Online, and actually, it's one of the very basic things that comes with a kind of an enterprise license or a business license. You even get it, I believe, with Business Basic. When we get into Dataverse, things get a bit more tricky, purely because Dataverse is essentially got two kinds of license. We'll talk about the second one a bit later. But it's generally afforded as its own part of specific licensing, and it's generally part of the Power Platform licensing. Access is generally gained through the purchase of either the per app or per user plans for licensing. Um, Per app is good if you have a few users that use a single application. But once you get into the realm of multiple apps backed in Dataverse with users using a combination of these apps, maybe one, two, three, per user becomes much more beneficial in terms of a cost benefit analysis. But obviously, as you can see from the slide, really Dataverse is that you're purchasing a per app or per user plan. And we have those two different access licenses. I said obviously that the licensing for Dataverse does have another type of license, which actually leads us quite cleanly onto our next bit, capacity constraints. Now, you might be thinking, why is capacity related to licensing? Well, actually, with Dataverse, your capacity is pooled across the tenant. Now, what that means is you will have a certain amount of capacity for your tenant for Dataverse storage, and then you assign that capacity from a central pool into each environment. As you can see there, capacity pooled across tenant, each environment is assigned a specific capacity. However, your total pool is impacted by the number of licenses you have. So, for instance, let's say, and there's no clean documentation on this, but let's say you start with 1 terabyte of Dataverse storage, and you have 10 users who have a per user license. Each of those might give you 10 gigabytes extra on top of your base capacity. And at that point, you're starting to look into, oh, okay, so the more users I have who are licensed, or the more apps I have that are licensed, the more total pool and total capacity I have. However, this second type of license then comes in with Dataverse, and this is why I call it a capacity constraint. These are called capacity add-ons. So you have two choices essentially for purchasing additional capacity for Dataverse. You have either you increase the number of users you have licensed using the per user, or you increase the number of apps you have licensed using the per app license, or you buy additional capacity add-ons from there. Now, when we look at capacity constraints, I have only been in two situations in 4 years, two clients who have basically come up to the Dataverse capacity. These are both in situations where they were basically just using one per app license. They had the baseline amount of storage, one per app license, and that was running a kind of a business critical application. Now, obviously, they were then having to purchase capacity add-ons to increase that. Um, but that's Dataverse. Obviously, in terms of the cost amount, in terms of capacity constraints, there is another kind of capacity with Dataverse that makes it a little bit more complex again. But we'll actually discuss that a bit later when we look at covering the kind of file storage element of Dataverse versus SharePoint. That being said, SharePoint's capacity constraints are a little bit easier to understand. So when you first get access to SharePoint, you get a base storage amount of 1 terabyte. You get an additional 10 gigabytes per kind of license. Now it says on there A3 to E5 license. This is actually outdated. So you actually get an additional 10 gigabytes per license apart from any licenses that are F1, F2, or F3. So let's say you have, again, 10 users, you're looking at who all have E3 licenses, you're looking at 1.1 terabytes worth of storage. Now, there are some other capacity constraints that come with it. So you are allowed up to 25 terabytes of storage maximum per site collection. If you manage to fill out a site collection with 25 terabytes of data, more than likely it's videos, you're going to have to spin up another site collection as long as you're not breaching your kind of overall storage to manage anything above 25 terabytes. Um, there are, again, capacity add-ons available for SharePoint that can increase your capacity and the amount that you're allowed to create or store. So yeah, SharePoint's very simple in terms of its capacity constraints, in terms of working out how much capacity you have, and in terms of outlining kind of how much you're allowed to store in each site collection. Obviously, Dataverse is a bit more flexible in that we have a limit on how much we're able to store in each environment, but that's decided, at the environment kind of settings level in terms of how much are you going to give it out of your total pool. Um, so, moving on. Permissions model, the big one. There is a significant difference between SharePoint and Dataverse when it comes to permissions model. So we'll start with what a lot of us know, SharePoint, right? So SharePoint runs an inherited permissions model. This essentially means that you set the permissions at a site collection level, and then items that are beneath that, like lists, document libraries, and things at lower levels, inherit the unique permissions for that parent level site. You can obviously break that inherited permissions, but you have to do that on a case by case basis. When we look at site, library, list, and item level permissions, they're typically controlled via SharePoint groups or Microsoft 365 groups. This normally leads to a site being permissioned and this deciding the permissions model for all items within the site. Okay, that means if you want a user to only have access to specific records, you then have to break the inherited permissions for each item you want to individually permission, and this can become quite tiresome. And obviously, we do have access to Power Automate and SharePoint REST API, which can do that work for us. But then from a security perspective, it becomes very difficult to track who has access to what unless you have some quite heavy tooling in terms of tracking that which items have broken inherited permissions and other bits. However, one of the things that SharePoint does have quite well out of the box is it has multiple predefined permission levels ranging from full control, which essentially if you sign full control permission level to a user on a SharePoint site, they have the ability to edit the SharePoint site, create new document libraries, create new lists, and do everything they need to do, all the way down to view only. And they're really easy for someone who is potentially not an administrator to just assign them to a specific group. SharePoint permissioning can be relatively simple in terms of that inherited permissions. You know what you're dealing with, you're setting it at the top level, and it's going to cascade down unless you decide to break that inheritance. Okay. But one thing it doesn't do well is kind of row level security and field level security. Okay, so when we look at SharePoint, one of the things we can't really do in SharePoint is if we had an item in a list and we say only wanted the let's say finance team to access column 1, 2, and 3, and the audit team to access columns 4, 5, and 6 on a specific item in the list, it's pretty much impossible to do that in terms of permission the item in that way. Okay, and this is where Dataverse really excels. So Dataverse operates a role-based security model. This allows for quite complex security when we look at things like business units, teams, security roles, and hierarchy-based permissions. Now, what that means is I can decide that, hey, for this specific item in a list, I want to be able to make it so that this specific team have the permission to view it or delete it, but their managers, when we look at hierarchy, have permission to view it, edit it, delete it, reshare it, and do a number of other things. If you've done work with security roles in Dataverse, you know that they're very, very extensive. You have the capability to really quite granularly define what a user is able to do, dependent on what role they fall in within the business or what position they fall within the business, or whether they have staff underneath them in terms of managerial hierarchy. There's quite a lot you can do with Dataverse, and that role-based security model is very, very robust and very kind of very flexible. The one thing Dataverse permissions model does really well is kind of row level security. This includes the ability to not only permission just an individual item like we can do with SharePoint and lists, but actually the columns within that item. That's, like I said, something you just can't do with SharePoint. So in the case where we wanted finance to see columns 1, 2, and 3, and audit to see columns 4, 5, and 6, Dataverse has the capability to do that by marking a specific column as secure and then assigning a security role to that column to identify, hey, anybody that has this security role, they need to be able to do X, Y, Z with this column. They need to be able to view it. They need to be able to edit it. They need to be able to, delete data from it, that kind of piece, right? So again, that record level and kind of not just row level, but column level security, that field security is really, really good. Now, just like with SharePoint, we have out of the box some predefined security roles. However, these are basic security roles applied to each environment. So these are things like the system administrator, the environment maker role, the basic user role. These are basic security roles that are applied to each environment, but what we've got to realize is when we're building solutions with Dataverse, a lot of the time we're creating custom tables. And whenever a custom table is created, this will only be accessible to specific roles. If you want users to be able to access the custom table, you need to create your own security roles to be able to define that. And actually, when we look at kind of Dataverse versus SharePoint in terms of ease of permissioning, at least when it comes to creating new items, as long as you've defined it at the site level, it's not too much of an issue. If a user comes into a document library for the first time that's only just been created, it's already got the permissions from the site. That's great. If we create a custom table in Dataverse and then we don't define that security role or we don't add that somewhere, that user's not going to be able to access that data. So we need to be able to do that. But that is the permissions model piece. So, security features, because this is one thing that I get asked every single time I come to a new client and they go, what's Dataverse got that SharePoint doesn't? And it's always the security team that are going to ask the questions to say yes, no. So both SharePoint and Dataverse use Microsoft Entra ID / Azure Active Directory, as it used to be known, for authentication. Now, that means that out of the box, both of these are enabled to use conditional access policies, which prevent things like impossible travel. Someone, let's say I log in the UK, and then all of a sudden my same account tries to log in Australia. 30 seconds later, that's an impossible travel conditional access policy. It can stop that, which means that we can stop the kind of access to SharePoint and Dataverse data that we potentially may not want. Things like multi-factor authentication and the other features that Enter ID enabled in terms of security features are both applicable to both SharePoint and Dataverse. And that's always something worth noting, because from an aspect of obviously security, we want those to be applicable to our data. But well, there's a few things that SharePoint does that Dataverse doesn't, and actually the security features around both of these are very different. What we've got to remember is that SharePoint was designed for file storage a lot of the time. It's designed for large files, unstructured data, rather than structured data. So the way to secure that is slightly different. One of the things that SharePoint has is something called the Information Rights Management System. Now, the information rights management can be enabled in the admin center and can then be applied to a document library or list through the document library settings. What the information rights management kind of security feature does is it allows you to provide protection to downloaded documents by applying things like encryption and usage restrictions to that downloaded document. It means that, for instance, if you were to download, let's say, I don't know, an Excel file that contained all of the permissions, locations, and personal information for the company, actually, if we had information rights management on there, we could prevent you from resharing that document, attaching it to a Outlook email to send it somewhere else, or we can prevent you from kind of being able to actually use it through the encryption piece. The other thing that SharePoint does is version history. While this is not technically a security feature, I've put it in here. It can be very helpful when rollbacks are required due to, you know, data being deleted or removed or maliciously kind of tampered with. It's worth noting that the version history in lists, specifically in SharePoint, is actually really good in terms of showing the content in terms of what the old version of the item was and what it has changed to. But that's not the case for documents in a document library. It doesn't show that level of content. For you to be able to see that, you have to restore it to the old version and then go in and look at it. Now, there's two on here. These are relatively less known, I find. Sensitivity labels and retention labels. These are something that, while not inherently inside of SharePoint, is designed to work with SharePoint just permanently. Sensitivity labels and retention labels can both be applied via Microsoft Purview. Used to be the Security Center, I believe, but they both do slightly different things. So sensitivity labels are essentially a way for you to label items dependent on how sensitive the content is. When a sensitivity label is applied to an item, you can configure that kind of sensitivity label policy to apply things like encryption, restrict actions inside of the document like copying and pasting or printing, or even apply watermarks to Word documents if that sensitivity was applied. It's really useful from a security perspective, because at least then you've got the ability to restrict actions on stuff that might be sensitive. Retention labels do something slightly different. Again, not entirely a security feature, but actually a way of stopping data that is required to be retained by law in some cases, or in most cases where this is used, from being deleted. So again, these are enabled through Microsoft Purview. They help you retain data and prevent important data from being deleted, especially helpful when dealing with public records. So within the UK, we have a public record system that means that certain types of records have to be retained for up to 7 years, or even longer in some cases. Retention labels can be used to prevent people from deleting that item when we need to retain it. Uh, with retention labels, there's a few things you can do. You need to specify when you set up a retention label the period that you want the document to be retained for in months, days, years. When the start of that retention period is, i.e., when the item was created, is that when our retention period starts? When was it when the item was last modified? If you select that option every time the document's modified, the counter resets. And then after that, you choose what happens after the retention period. Now, these can be things like, hey, we want you to automatically delete that document. Or, hey, what we want to happen is we want to essentially have a a person within the compliance team be notified. And then they have to review the document. Now, that is doable via Power Automate, but SharePoint has this built in. So it's worthwhile using. So there's some of the security features that SharePoint have, and you'll notice that a lot of it is centered around not the list items, but the documentation and the document libraries. Okay, and that's purely because, like I said, SharePoint was a lot of the time designed for that unstructured data, that file storage piece. Now, in terms of Dataverse, this does massively focus on the structured data. So we're looking at table structures where we've got rows and columns, right? So what has Dataverse got in terms of its security features? Well, field level security. We've kind of already touched on that. So like I said, certain columns can be marked as secure, further restricting users' ability to view or edit a field in a row based on their security role. It offers that kind of more granular control of the security of a specific record than SharePoint would allow within a document library or list. Um, Next one down, this is something that is actually baked within the kind of Power Platform as a whole, but it's really useful for Dataverse. Data loss prevention policies. Now, these data loss prevention policies allow administrators of an environment to decide what connectors are available to users within a specific environment. These policies can also change how data in Dataverse can be shared with external connectors and ensure that sensitive data isn't compromised by putting it through, let's say, a third-party connector that maybe isn't secure. The other thing we have in there, business rules. Again, another one that, while it isn't technically a security feature, it does help maintain data integrity and can aid in data compliance, right? Business rules enable us as users to and makers to define a rule that sets specific fields as business required and restricts either the update of a record or the creation of a record if certain conditions aren't met. Now, in terms of an element of compliance and a security feature, I find that's really, really useful because when we look at what data might be put in, incomplete data can be fed into feed reporting that may lead to poor business decisions, right? So those business rules are a barrier to that if configured correctly, and so that's why I put it in the security features area. So the next one down, this is one of my personal favorites, auditing. Um, for anybody that's seen the auditing in Dataverse, you'll know that it is extensive. Um, it can track when an item is accessed, created, updated, deleted. It tells you what the changes were, when they were done, what the old version was, what the new version is, and who did it. And it retains that for a long time. Now, the auditing capability is huge because it allows admins to see who accesses, who changed what data, and when they did it, and it means that we can then roll it back. It's relatively similar to the version history, but a lot more detailed. It can even capture things like a plugin interacting with a specific record rather than a user, which is really, really useful and really, really powerful. But those are the security features that kind of sit within SharePoint Dataverse. The difference, obviously, overall between the two, as we're seeing with this, is now we're starting to divert away from um, are we looking at items of data? Well, actually, SharePoint seems to configure its security for um, documents rather than SharePoint list items. Dataverse seems to do it for unstructured data for, records and rows. Um, One of the other bonuses, I've got it on here as a bit bonus solutions, nice big capital letters. For those of you who have kind of worked with me and I've helped teach in certain ways in terms of how you start a Power Platform project, you'll know that I always say to you, once you start building, build it in a solution. Dataverse actually enables that solution. The reason I've got it in here as a security feature is because solutions allow you to conduct proper application lifecycle management. Okay, it also means that you can use managed solutions so that you can deploy your Power Platform solutions and not have them be changed or tampered with without kind of some level of effort. That's why they're in here as a security feature, because of that bit around the managed solutions. It makes life a lot easier and it does protect you from unwanted changes to your solutions. Okay, moving on. Data modeling. This is always a fun topic. I do love a bit of data modeling. So what's the difference between SharePoint and Dataverse? Now, when we look at it, I've just said on the previous slide that SharePoint wasn't designed for full kind of relational data. Okay, in terms of it seems to be more geared towards document storage and manipulation than it does towards data modeling. And we're starting to see that diverge a bit more. So, what's the difference? Well, SharePoint is list-based databasing, whereas Dataverse is relational databasing. And what that means is with SharePoint, like I said, SharePoint was never designed to act as a full relational database. We don't have any rich relationship types in there, such as one to many to one, and our many to many. We can kind of make it do it in terms of we can add a lookup column, or we can add a foreign key column and take the ID from another record in there, but it's not there inherently as an option. Okay, it's something we have to configure and set up in such a way to get it to do that. Um, it can be used for light structured data that's going to fall below the kind of limit. So when I call out the limit, it's the 5,000 records. You might have seen this, or 2,000 records, depending on how Power Platform is set up. But you'll end up with pesky delegation errors if you go over that amount, and SharePoint can be quite tricky for that. But your ideal use case for SharePoint will be a document-centric or simple data scenarios such as things like task lists, basic trackers. Um, that isn't to say, just being fair here, don't try and push the limits of what SharePoint can do. But speaking from recent experience with a client, once your SharePoint structure gets to a certain level of data, you start to experience significant performance degradation. Okay, and we've seen it with a client recently where basically people were just unable to load the app at all. It was just white screening. They had a significant amount of data, and we had to basically account for archiving a large amount of that data to make it not available to them anymore. When we look at Dataverse, I mentioned obviously about that is relational databasing rather than list based. Now what that means is Dataverse allows us to have those rich relationship types, that one to many to many kind of relationships. We have a full suite of tools available to us in terms of relational databasing, and that's purely because Dataverse is actually backed by Azure SQL. Okay, it's a very nice skin over Azure SQL that allows us to do a few other features. It's a true relational database because we can define cascading behaviors to enforce relationships. So that's the reason why SharePoint isn't a relational database. It's because if I were to create a lookup column in SharePoint and I delete the record that it's related to, that's going to break that relationship. Whereas in Dataverse, we can define the behavior for deletion of a child item or a related item to stop it. We have to stop it from deleting that item. Okay, that's what defines Dataverse as a relational database. We can define that cascading behavior in terms of items that are deleted and how the relationship between two records kind of works. Now, we look at obviously SharePoint. I mentioned about the limited relational capabilities. Like I said, you can create lookup columns. It does look like a relational database. You can create that lookup column to reference data in another list, but there's no enforcement of that relationship. You can delete a referenced item without restriction, and this will a lot of the times just break the lookup. Okay. There are a few options now starting to sneak in that I'm seeing on lookup columns where it does restrict delete and a few others, but that doesn't always work. It's temperamental. But the other thing, kind of major difference between SharePoint and Dataverse in terms of data modeling, the data types. So SharePoint holds some basic data types where it's things like single line of text, multi-line text, and a few others. What's missing is things like calculated or roll-up fields, right? These are columns that do specific things within Dataverse that Dataverse has, that SharePoint just does not have. Uh, while you can create calculated fields within SharePoint, they can be very temperamental. I've got a good example of this. We have a calculated hyperlink field in SharePoint for a client at the moment, and it's based upon the value in another column. If that column is not present in the view, the calculated column completely breaks. Um, we don't know why. It shouldn't, but it's there. And because of those issues, because it's not again designed to essentially do that, we call them as basic data types. But Dataverse has rich data types. But what does that mean? Well, rich data types are things like obviously we've got our text, our number, date and time, currencies, option sets where we look at single or multi-select. We've got lookups. We've also got calculated fields, roll-up fields, and a load of others. And the reason why they're called rich data types is because they follow the kind of data typing for SQL, right? Again, we're going back to the fact that Dataverse is just SQL on the back end. It's Azure SQL on the back end with a good skin over it that makes it easy to use, right? It's got a few other features in there in terms of kind of business logic, which is actually the next main difference around the data modeling. Okay, a lot of people don't think of business logic as part of the data modeling, but it is. It's a really important part. So when we look at business logic SharePoint, you can implement business logic in SharePoint, but it has to be through Power Automate. It's not inherent to SharePoint. It's an addition that you then create and modify yourself. It's not out of the box. Dataverse has business logic out of the box. These are things like our business rules, our business process flows, things like calculated and roll-up fields are technically classed as business logic when we look at roll-up fields that look at an activity table and go, hey, what's the duration of every single activity that's happened against this parent record? That's a roll-up field that we can use to calculate that, and that's a bit of business logic. All these bits of business logic are actually at the database level. They're not something additional that you build on top like they are in SharePoint. And again, it's another thing to consider when we look at data modeling. That's a major difference between SharePoint and Dataverse, is that data logic is inherently there in Dataverse. It's not in SharePoint. Okay, so file storage. Now, this is a simple one, and this is one where actually, SharePoint wins out. SharePoint was designed to work as file storage, and while you can store files in Dataverse using things like the file column or attachments or notes, you end up consuming a very specific kind of capacity within Dataverse called file capacity. I mentioned that there was another type of capacity in the capacity constraints a bit further up. This is it. Uh, File capacity in Dataverse is treated separately to your main capacity, and it can fill up very quick, and it's expensive. And so when it comes to this category, when we look at file storage, there's only one thing I really need to say about this. If your solution is going to deal with large files, be it video files or, mass amounts of data in an Excel spreadsheet, or, some really, really large kind of resolution photographs, use SharePoint to manage those files. Don't use Dataverse. Um, like we can see on the screen, SharePoint can store and manage large files. On Dataverse, files can be stored in file columns or as attachments on the note. One thing to note, the file column, if I remember correctly, the last time I used it was about 2 months ago, actually stores the file as base64, and actually has a top end character limit, which you then have to adjust if your file doesn't upload correctly. Um, so that's another thing to kind of note, is that there are some very specific settings for that file column. But again, when I'm looking at a solution personally, if I'm looking at storing files, I'm doing it in SharePoint. Okay. So other. I had to add this in here because I nag on about it consistently to kind of my colleagues, and anybody I can get to listen. Uh, Application Lifecycle Management. That's what ALM stands for. SharePoint. When we are building solutions that are backed in SharePoint, it becomes very difficult to manage application lifecycle management unless you use environment variables to manage references to your SharePoint lists. And in that case, what you end up having to do is to create 3 separate SharePoint sites and then 3 separate copies of your lists if you're running, let's say, dev, test, and production, and then changing that as you go through. Dataverse is brilliant for application lifecycle management because the tables that you create are solution aware. They are contained within the solution that you create your kind of uh, objects in. That's your power apps, your Power Automate flows, all of that. And it means that rather than having to recreate SharePoint sites, change environment variable references, and all that, what you end up having to do is just import the solution. Dataverse has that benefit as well. And alongside that, if we look at kind of integration into Azure DevOps pipelines and Power Platform pipelines, Dataverse becomes a lot easier to use when we look at that kind of continuous improvement and continuous development pipelines piece. That's why it's here. So, in summary, both technologies have their merits. I say this very cleanly. I started my Power Platform journey with SharePoint. I made it do some wonderful things. It was really, really good. But when you get to dealing with enterprise level data, large amount of records, large file storages, you kind of have to learn to use Dataverse. Again, both of them have their limitations as well. We've said that Dataverse can't deal with large files where SharePoint can. So in my experience, you're going to end up using both of these technologies to create solutions. So it's good to be comfortable with both, be it SharePoint lists or document libraries or SharePoint as a whole, and be comfortable with Dataverse and how to use it. But overall, if I'm building a relational database and I have the licensing, I'm going to use Dataverse because it's designed for relational databasing. However, conversely, if I have to deal with large files in my solution, I'm going to use SharePoint to manage those because it's designed for that. So overall, my point on this is it's great to know the differences between the two, but you're going to be using both if you're going to be working with Power Platform. At one point or another, you're going to run into document-centric solutions that use SharePoint consistently, or you're going to run into, a ticketing system that only needs to use Dataverse. So be comfortable with both, and they are both good. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful and got to learn something new, and I'll see you in the next one.